When the two main speakers have finished the introductory bit, as I said, we'll open up for discussion. Each person from the floor will have you indicate with the electronic hand, which is at the bottom of your screen. Each person will have about 3 minutes to make their contribution, maximum of 3 minutes, to allow maximum participation. We are not necessarily going to have a direct Q&A, question and answer, where in terms of what comes from the floor and the speakers. They'll each have an opportunity right at the end to make their to summarize and make their final comments and address any outstanding issues. However, in the course of the discussion, if it will help to clarify a particular point or to stimulate further thoughts, as me as facilitator, if I deem it helpful, I'll bring them back. So by and large, that's what it is. And it's about 4:10 now. We're almost 4:10, so we can get going. And when each person speaks, many of us don't know each other. If you have the necessary data and you have a stable enough connection, it will be helpful to show your face at least for the first time, so that we know who we're speaking with. These online meetings are a bit, unnatural as it is. And then, later on, any subsequent intervention you make, at least we know who it is. You don't need to show your face. So, comrades, yes, we'll get started now. I'll ask Kofi to start, and then, I'm going to mute myself and mute everybody else. For the time being, until it is your turn to speak. So, Kofi, without further ado, please take the floor. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Baz, and thank you all for being here. Sorry for my distracting background, but I'm going to share my slide now, so you didn't see it for too long. As you can see,
it's not coming up like before. Let me make you co-host, and then we can.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so I hope you can all see my slide now. Okay, thank you. So I have a somewhat uninteresting and very broad title, but what I'll do is to draw on a number of recent studies I've been involved in to ground the presentation in some detail. Specifically, I would be talking about two studies I was involved in, and one that I'm currently working through with Pfizer. So we are very much looking forward to feedback. And this is going to be the outline. I'll start with a very brief historical context, and then talk about 3 types of failures which explain a large part of the agrarian problem Ghana is currently facing. So the first is a policy failure. So these failures are in 3 different levels. We have policy failure, failure in civil society intervention to address these failures, and a failure of mobilization. So I'll go on. Just a minute, sorry. Okay, thank you. So I'll look first at the overall policy context for agricultural policy making. After independence, we had very heavy state intervention in agriculture, but not only in agriculture, in the manufacturing and other sectors. For about a decade and a half, although there was a good deal of policy volatility after Nkrumah was overthrown, obviously the movement between Buzia and the other military regime, and the early years of the Rawlings intervention, especially June 4th, the June 4th revolution. In the 80s, things stabilized a bit, in the sense that we have one regime in place for close to a decade. But that period also involved a hard turn to the right. the withdrawal of most subsidies and a turn to the market for macroeconomic stability. And what that did was to shift political incentive, both at the level of political elite, but also at the level of the grassroots. And as I go on in the presentation, I'll show how that affected the policies that were put in place, how they were implemented, but also the options or possibilities for pushing back against ineffective policies. And of course, after the 80s or the era of the PNDC, Ghana was ushered into a democratic period, which we can still see as a period of transition, right? It's just about 30 years in the making, and I feel like a lot of the dynamics we are observing is actually an indication of a transition rather than a settled state. But there are a few key characteristics of this period which shape agricultural policymaking, but also other aspects of political life. First is that we are trying to pursue economic and political liberalization, which in a sense are incompatible goals, because economic liberalization or adjustment of the type that Rawlings was forced to undertake in the 80s, well, it's a very painful process and politically and economically costly. To combine that with political liberalization, which demands of political leaders to actually pay attention to the needs of the people and for demands which may go against the goals of economic liberalization, especially of austerity, is a tough one to combine. So that also explains some of the policy failures that I will talk about. The second feature is that we have two main political parties who, in theory, or at least as they avow it openly, they are different in terms of ideological outlook. But then in practice, what differentiates them is the approach to implementation rather than the ideological underpinnings of the policies that they propose. And I think this is also a very important issue, and it partly accounts for why things like corruption or incompetence, things like that are a lot more salient arguments during elections or in the run-up to elections than things like the ideological basis of policies which have been implemented. And for why we have the very confusing situation where MPP seems to be sometimes proposing social policies, whilst the NDC sometimes, which is supposed to be social democratic, towing the line of market policies. The third feature of the political period now is what I'll call the power of the polls, which means that, as I said earlier, we have this large or overarching policy commitment to austerity and fiscal prudence, but especially in the run-up to election, we have a lot of budget deficit or spending outside the budget cycle. And this has been explained by referring to new patrimonialism. Of course, in the literature, when they are talking about new patrimonialism, it's a large umbrella which includes things like corruption and the distribution of state offices to cronies and things like that. But then so neo-patrimonialism is one way of saying it. Another way would be to look at the logic of electoral competition, right? And although democratization has been offered as a solution to corruption and neo-patrimonialism, as is defined in the literature, it actually, in a way, fuels it directly. The final point I want to draw attention to is this idea of choiceless democracy, which is used to describe the situation where African countries were advised, or in a sense coerced, to democratize, but because of the overbearing influence of donor partners, developmental partners, so-called, in a way, external actors seem to have a lot more influence in policy making in the agriculture and other sectors than the citizens themselves. Okay, so now I would quickly, I know I've used a bit of time, I'll quickly go over some of the policies. And what the attention I want to draw here is that as compared to the period from the mid-60s to the late 70s, we've had a lot more policy stability. So from 2002 to the current period, we've had different agricultural policies, from the food and agri-sector development policy, as the first stage was implemented in 2002, and the second one in 2007. From 2010 to 2013, there was the Ghana Shared Growth and Development Agenda, which was actually continued from 2014 to 2017. And between 2011 and 2015, we had what they call MECASIP, Ghana Medium Term Sector Investment Plan, from 2011 to 2015 under both Mills and Mahama. And the third phase of that project actually started under Akufo-Addo. And it is under this MECASIP project, which is a continuation of what was started under Mills, that we have the planting for food and jobs. And these policies have had, there's a shared goal across all of these policies. So one, there's the goal of boosting agricultural productivity. Right, for the tree crops or the industrial crops, the goal is explicitly to boost export revenue. But for the food crops, of course, to meet domestic demands. But then there's also a direct goal of using agricultural productivity to spur the rural economy, and also to reduce poverty. And some of the programs under these policies are also very similar. So if we take some of the big policy blocks from 2017 to 2016, there's been a focus on agricultural mechanization, using subsidized tractor services. There's been a focus on block farms, where the policy is to consolidate smaller farms so that government can more efficiently provide extension services and things like input support and credit. And then there's been the marketing block as well. One arm of which is NAFCO, the National Food Buffer Stock Company, whose goal is to purchase goods so that there will be price stability, both during bumper seasons, to guarantee price for farmers, and during periods of shortage to stabilize prices for consumers. And then there's the fertilizer component. And this is kind of a controversial bit, because we know the use of organic fertilizer has all kinds, the use of chemical fertilizer has all kinds of negative impact on the soil, and in places like India, where it's also led to death and farmer suicide and things like that. So that's a problem. But then the subsidizing of fertilizer has come in vogue since the early 2000s after the Abuja Fertilizer Summit. And it was also spurred by the food and energy crisis in that year, 2006, 2007. So there has been a policy motive to increase the usage of fertilizer in order to boost agricultural productivity. And of course, since 2017, when the NPP returned to power, these same policies have been pursued, but under the wider ambit of the Planting for Food and Jobs program. So the provision of certified seeds, of fertilizers, of extension services, provision of marketing support are all, kind of drawing directly from the earlier policies. The new introduction is the e-agriculture, which actually hasn't taken off. And under the current agricultural policy environment, there's a tree crop, live crop, mechanization, and a greenhouse model. I won't go maybe too much into this in the interest of time. And maybe I can skip this slide too, but during the Q&A, I would come back to it. Now, if we go back briefly, under the PFJ, we have 5 large policy blocks, the provision of seeds, of fertilizers, extension services, marketing support, and e-agriculture. If we look at the budget, the estimated budget for the Planting for Food and Jobs, we could see where the priority has laid. This table is in millions of Ghana cedis. So out of a total of, in 2020, out of a total of 1.1 billion Ghana cedis, 347 million was spent on seeds, 729 was spent on fertilizer, and very little was spent on extension, 76 million, e-agriculture, 15 million, and very little on marketing of produce, which is a problem because one of the key problems facing farmers is access to market, a good deal of which involves the very poor road connection between farm gate and market. So I've already spoken about the rationale for the fertilizer subsidy program. Maybe I'll just mention briefly that Ghana has historically had a very low rate of fertilizer usage. And the aim of the program is to increase the usage of fertilizer from 7.4 kilograms per hectare to 20 kilograms per hectare, which is still below the Africa average of 50 kilograms per hectare as the broad goal of the policy there. In terms of current or prevailing usage of fertilizer before the Abuja conference on fertilizer, the Africa average was 8%, which was like 0.6% higher than Ghana's. So now very quickly, I'll move to the study that we conducted on the oil palm sector and the policy environment for it. So if you look at the graph on the left, the annual production of oil palm in tonnage, we don't even need to mention the actual figures, but you could see across the years from 2016 to 2015, smallholders have consistently dominated oil palm production, both in the production of the raw fruits and in the production of crude palm oil. right? Medium scale mills produce a little bit, but large scale mills do well, but far short of smallholder production. And this is important to note because government policy targeting the sector, in particular the planting for export and rural development, in the language of it and in orientation, seem to be targeting the domestic, well, when I say domestic, I'll come to it shortly because the oil palm value chain is actually bifurcated. So the policy seems to be targeting the industrial sector, that's estate companies. However, in terms of the actual implementation, the target is, or the beneficiaries are smallholder farmers. But then it targets them in a way that doesn't address the core problems of the sector. So if you look at the graph on the right, it's a diagram of the oil palm value chain. The estate or industrial segment of the value chain is on the left. So they have their own nucleus plantations, nucleus farms, and outgrower schemes by which they work with smaller farmers to plant land. And then the output or the produce is milled in their industries, and then it undergoes further processing into soaps, cooking oil, and other industrial products. Although the market for, or the industry for higher end processing is not well developed in Ghana. On the right side of the value chain diagram, we have the independent smallholders who are either medium scale mills or artisanal mills. Well, you have the farmers who farm small plots of land, anything from 2 hectares to about 50 hectares. And the medium scale mills who usually have their own farms, but of a smaller size, much smaller than the estate plantations. Now, the produce from the small holders and the medium scale mills often end up on the domestic market because Ghana has a very large local demand for palm oil, which is actually unmet. And I don't think the last figure I saw, and one other problem of the sector is that data isn't collected very regularly. In fact, last year when I was collecting data for this project, the survey and research department of MOFA didn't have the up-to-date figures. And in fact, the Planting for Export and Rural Development program actually depends on estimates. But then by the latest figures I could lay my hands on actually shows that we don't meet even half of the local demand. And there's also a very large West African demand. So when the Presidential Special Initiative on Oil Palm was put in place by Akufo, that was part of the motivation. In 2010, under Mills, there was also an attempt to, they actually contracted an organization to develop a master plan for the oil palm sector, which wasn't implemented. And currently under the PFG, very broadly, and the Planting for Export and Rural Development, there's a return to basically the same policy.
I'll give you about 5 minutes more.
Okay, thank you. Sure. All right, so there's there's a large unmet local and sub-regional demand. There's also, the government is also prioritizing the oil palm sector because of the need to preserve foreign exchange, because we import so much. However, the problem, one of the key problems that smallholders face is not access to inputs in the form of seedlings, but access to markets, which is one, improving the road network, and also access to very simple processing technology, which could vastly boost livelihood, but also help to meet a large part of the domestic demand. But then the policy over the years since 2006 has always been to provide seedlings, which is actually makes sense within the electoral context. So I've actually gone over a lot of the information on this slide. Maybe let me mention briefly the problem. So I've already spoken about the problems that smallholders face. The problem that the bigger companies face is access to reliable fruits, because as we saw in the graph that I showed earlier, they don't produce enough to meet their manufacturing capacity. So there's that problem. And in the lean season, they fight among themselves to get access to fruits from the farmers. We have four large oil palm companies. The other problem facing the industrial sectors or the estates is the power of GUTA, the Ghana Union of Traders Association, who import cheap cooking oils, which competes with the domestically produced cooking oil. But GUTA has a lot more organized power than the Oil Palm Association, which is the Oil Palm Development Association of Ghana. And so when it comes to this issue, for instance, recently, the reduction of benchmark prices on imported goods, which included cooking oil. Government initially exempted cooking oil from it, but they had to quickly go back because GUTA threatened them or maybe lobbied them. So this is the source of some of the policy failures. Government's main intervention here, which is very expensive, has been to provide input in the form of seedlings, but which doesn't really address the problem. And when it comes to these direct distributional interventions, there's also a huge potential for corruption there. A study conducted in 2010 by Ifua Banfo found that in the distribution of fertilizer, the distribution formula was actually manipulated so that areas that the sitting government lost by a narrower margin got more fertilizers than other areas. So there's a lot of corrupt incentives there as well. So here I would segue quickly into the second part of the presentation, which is the fertilizer subsidy. Like I've said earlier, there's a lot of motivation for the implementation of these policy interventions to be corrupted. And as you know, a lot of high-level reforms have been done. For instance, the distribution of the fertilizer was initially done using vouchers, which could easily be manipulated in terms of the distribution, to a way bill system in 2010, under which government actually absorbed the costs of processing or clearing the fertilizers from the ports. And that reduced the price of fertilizer. But that didn't totally reduce the incentive for corruption. And as a lot of us are aware, the issue of smuggling of fertilizer to Burkina Faso and Togo is still very rampant. In fact, in a study that I did on the issue of smuggling of these fertilizers, farmers in neighboring in the border communities, especially in Tumu, says that they often have to go to markets in Burkina Faso to buy fertilizer because it's just not available inside the country. So because institutional mechanisms have not worked because of the lack of political will, social accountability, which is activism by civil society actors to hold public officials accountable, has been embraced mainly by donor partners who find civil society as an effective tool for deepening governance. So I won't go too much into the details here, but what I would say is that this strategy achieved some success. For instance, the shift from using vouchers to weigh bill in the distribution of the fertilizer was partly a result of activism by civil society. They also lobbied for other changes to be made, minor programmatic changes, but like changing the bagging of the subsidized fertilizer from 50 kg bags to 25 kg bags, so that it's easier to differentiate the subsidized fertilizers on the market. But there's also been very close collaboration between civil society volunteers, mainly community organizations and farmer-based organizations, and security agencies and some state actors. So there's success there. But then the failure comes to the main reason why the former mechanisms for anti-corruption have not worked in the first place, which is the lack of political will. So many of these activists at the community level don't have any legal backing for the work they do. And one told me that he was, plainly told by a security official that his life may be in danger because many of the smugglers actually have backing from Accra and within their community. But there's also the issue of
can I smuggle in a reminder that you have to wind up right now, please?
Okay, thank you. I'll do so now. So within the task forces that they've set up to monitor and impound smugglers, they have some of their own members who sometimes aid and abet the issue of smuggling. So because I'm out of time, I will just touch on the key findings here. This is a third study we did on the farmer-based organization, again, in oil palm growing communities. What we found was that in many communities, farmers' organizations were either non-existent or extremely weak. And there were a number of reasons. Of course, there was the issue of unaccountable leadership and what you may call a situation of like waiting for Godot. These associations are formed because of the expectation of some benefit from government or NGOs who help to set up, but the promised support doesn't come and then they lose interest. But then one of the main problems is the personal cost of mobilizing and engaging in these associations, which fall very heavily on poorer farmers who can't afford the time and the resources necessary to engage in some kinds of collective action, like withholding their goods until the prices go up. And because poorer farmers cannot be depended on within the associations to push through these kinds of collective actions, what ends up happening is that wealthier farmers or better off farmers organize separately outside the purview of the associations. And so we find inequality actually intensifying, and the farmers who could have benefited from these kinds of collective action actually losing out of it. So I would conclude very briefly by going over what I said in the beginning, that we have some features of the current political system, which I think is in transition, which affects how policy regarding agriculture is made and how it's implemented, which includes the partisan cleavage, not on ideological lines, but in terms of implementation of policy, and the tyranny of the pools, which make politicians a lot more willing to prioritize short-term goals in order to win elections than longer-term, more transformative agricultural policy, which actually indicates the obvious need for mobilization. But as the third study, which I mentioned, shows, there's a key impediment in the way of poorer farmers to engage in that kinds of mobilization. So thank you very much. I'll end here, and sorry for going over time.
Thanks, Kofi. Very interesting. As for time, I think we are all victims of it one way or the other. I'm going to mute you now. It's an interesting presentation, obviously, and I think that indirectly and directly you've illustrated the pressures of commercialization, of private interests becoming predominant in a context where, on the one hand, there's social differentiation and growing inequality, which is the point that you landed on. On the other hand, in terms of real investment that can transform the sector, agrarian sector, so at least if we deduce from the oil palm and other areas that you focused on, those are deeply challenged. Then there's the export dependence and so on. And of course, I think that one of our interests here as socialists generally, but also as people from a social justice concern, is to see what set of different interests, social interests, can combine in a transformative agenda which addresses the social justice dimensions just as much as it does in terms of the development transformation agenda as well. So that's one of the purposes of this discussion. As we go along, please, if I may remind the participants, please post any comments, questions in the chat. When the next speaker finishes as well, you can indicate by your electronic hand when you want to speak. And on this note, I'll invite the next speaker, Faisal, to take up. Faisal, so we'll aim to give you 20 minutes, but we might have to cut you at some point.
Okay, cool. Thanks, but I will try and do less than 20 minutes. Okay, thanks, comrades. I want to begin from where Kofi ended, where he was talking about the farmer-based organizations and the kind of work they do. So basically, this presentation is an attempt by Kofi and I to think through, some ideas that we've been bouncing off each other and work that we're doing. The first really is around farmer-based organizing, outside of organizing for market access or commercialization, right? That seems to be the dominant form in which farmer-based organizations function. And we are interested in rural struggles more as we look at farmer-based organization. The second part of what we are doing is to look at the capacity of organized workers, and I mean workers defined broadly, including those considered unemployed, but also those doing work that is not valorized, for a meaningful transformation, a radical transformation that has got some content. In terms of the structure, I will quickly talk about two things. The first is to, speak about some elements really of rural livelihoods and struggles, drawing largely on some work in the Upper East around climate change, but also work that we plan to do in other parts of the country. I will then draw on some of my work on migrant youth traveling across the Sahara and what that says about rural livelihood. And finally, I will raise some points for discussion around what all this means for contemporary struggles, in terms of fusing struggles together. So the agrarian crisis, is often understood by the dominant political players when you hear Mahama speak and the response from the MPP, as whether there's going to be food shortage or not. So it's about food. But I think it is more than that. Yes, it is about food, but the agrarian crisis or the agrarian question is also about capital accumulation and differentiation, right? Who owns what? Who has the space to have resources relative to those who do not, but also about gender relations and access to land, the use of labor at the household level, but also in the public sphere, and gender social relations. And the agrarian crisis is also about who belongs, defining who belongs and who does not belong. And I'll try to explain what I mean by this. So there's a lack of rural economic diversification across the country, right? And this leads to a continuous dependence on land-based livelihoods. This is linked with the food insecurity question that the agrarian crisis is limited to. So if you take, say, parts of the Upper East region, right, you have this situation of occasional flood, but also drought, right? And many of the farmers we spoke to said, look, this planting for food and jobs thing, it comes really late. The timing of the support is late to the extent that it becomes useless when they need the support. And linked to that is, an ongoing increase really in prices of food, which indicates food shortage, which is what the debate in the dominant political circles is limited to. Now, what is important for us, I think, this is not to say that above are not important, it's really the reality that you have an increase in paid labor on commercial farms, on plantations, but even on outgrower farms. And this, I think, is important in understanding, one, the question of commercialization, market relations, and also displacement of small holders. Because there's the more broad theoretical argument that is made that the working class is disappearing. Industries are closing, and so the working class as this hub of organizing for transforming society really does not exist anymore. Now, the point that I'm trying to make is that some of our work is really showing the opposite of that, and others have theoretically made the argument before us. Now, this displacement is closely linked to speculation in land, land as financial instrument, to be traded and used as hedges. This is happening in a context in rural Ghana where you have mass unemployment, right? And really despondency. So I've done some work with aspiring migrants who travel through Libya, in order to reach Europe. Some of them are trapped in Niger. And the point they make is that, look, we had a family land and the value of the land, increased. And some, paterfamilias, decided to either lease or sell the land. And so these young people who initially thought they could make a living off the land do not have land. And secondly, the conditions of employment are so unacceptable that they do not consider it a useful venture. This is also linked to the question of gender inequality, right, in access to resources, because some of these people are young women, right? Patriarchal norms that have been used to deny women access to land would be that, no, your rights are dependent not on especially in patrilineal settings, not on your immediate family, but on the family you get married into. Although in other situations they say, no, you are a stranger into this family, so you cannot have access to land. But also farming inputs is very much gendered from the connections that men make, because men and women start off differently in terms of their relationship to resources. The connections that men have, to whether it's state structures or a pool of other farmers from whom they can get communal resources, it's not open to women. Now, there's also what I call tenure, tension, and nativism, right? So we know that migrant labor is an old thing in plantations, but also in the emergent commercial farms, and also on outgrower kind of plots, because there are tenure arrangements that allow migrants, to farm a plot of land over time. But with the advent, well, not advent, but the intensification of commercialization, what you have is a situation where these tenure arrangements are completely done away with, and many migrant farmers or just migrants do not have any source of livelihood. And this is linked to this question, what is called the header farmer crisis in Ghana or in West Africa, really. The idea that somehow the Fulani, are invaders, it is not unrelated to the fact that this accumulation by a small group of people does away with existing usufruct arrangements around tenure that allows cattle herders to use certain paths, as in PAPH, certain paths, while in other seasons, farmers cultivate it. So commercialization, in a sense, this increasing commercialization leads to a new demarcation of who belongs and who does not belong. And often here you have some of the most regressive ideas of nativism being mobilized for that. So what does this mean for politics? And I'm trying to move quickly because I know we don't have a lot of time. The first is to repeat what I said earlier, that the working class is not disappearing. Yes, there's a decline in jobs, but work is done. Social roles from care to social reproduction and semi-wage labor relations on farms continue. So there is the working class. And if you understand the working class, not just as people who are on the job, but really people's relations, to capital, then the working class exists and it is expanding. And I think in the time of COVID, we're beginning to see how really this close association between work and income, it's a fiction, because most of those who provide the basic care that is needed today are not those that are paid, So this thing about the working class disappearing, I think is really a myth. But what we're seeing, though, is a reconfiguration of work relations on farms, through what I'll call semi-proletarian labor relations. This then places a limitation, one on organization of agricultural labor. So the nature of employment on farms, often this temporary, seasonal, and casual employment, makes it very difficult for unions, to organize. And I wish there's somebody from GAU, on the call today, so we can hear more from them. So in the work that we are doing, really, we're asking a set of questions, and some of the questions can be broadly put this way. Let's say one cluster of the questions is this: can FBOs, meaning farmer-based organizations, be made to serve non-market access functions alone, but also move towards civic action and mass-based politics? And this is what we mean by this: that there's a limit on commercialization. So or the basis of differentiation on the farm. So the classical Lenin Shan of the debate whether differentiation is purely a function of family size comes into play. Because I think land alienation and other structural limitations makes it impossible for even the most ambitious farmers who, well, not farmers, the most ambitious people who have maybe 1 hectare, but are at the risk of losing it because some elder wants to lease it to a plantation that has moved into the area. So therefore, the question of fusing struggles becomes not a subjective thing, but an objective thing that the condition imposes on people. That really, these are young people who are unemployed, and many of them might come to Accra, but there's nothing to do in Accra, really, because you also have a teeming unemployed population. So how does that tie up with struggles, broadly defined? And here maybe the question would be to people to say formations like ours that are really thinking about fundamental social transformation. How do we relate to these issues? And the final point I want to make really is a research agenda that Kofi and I have, and which is to understand the present state of social differentiation. Firstly, assets and ownership structures, right? Who owns what, in what magnitude, and how does that relate to relationships of employment, to demarcations around gender and other markers of social belonging. So thank you very much. I'll stop here in the hope that we have not spent too much time. Thanks, Bas. I think the point is really the conversation and not.
Thanks, Faisal. I'm sure in the discussion you will get an opportunity to come back. And thanks for adding a political sociology dimension, if you like, to the economic and governance. Not a word I particularly favor, but governance, pressures and considerations that Kofi was talking about. Of course, within all this, we would also benefit from a more, if you like, a deeper engagement with the whole political economy question, the way in which the economic structures of the agrarian, the agrarian economic structures are changing, and how the broader national and, if you like, global context for that as well, and what those mean in terms of, transforming our economy from, raw material dependency, export dependency, and so on, because both of you refer to the challenges that these things pose in terms of, unemployment and the various, social inequalities that you talked about. But anyway, without further ado, I'm going to open the floor now. And as I said, 2 ways to contribute. We hope everybody contributes, including those who want to fill in the gaps of, add to what the 2 comrades have said. And, please indicate by your electronic hand, but also please post your comments or questions in the chat as well, which I will read out from time to time. Which, and any of us can pick up any of the questions. I think that we're beginning a semi-exploratory process of educating ourselves to develop not simply an understanding, but to develop agendas where, both research and activist intervention, and a platform around which those things can crystallize and mature. So please, no holds barred. We want as rigorous a discussion as we can get in the short time that we have available. So please indicate when you want to speak by raising your electronic hand, and you can post, comments, questions in the chat as well. The first person we have is Alassane, I think. Alas, go ahead. Yeah.
Right. Thanks, Bas. Thanks, Faisal and Kofi. That's really interesting presentations. My question is: have you guys looked at the role of extension officers in this and how the whole reform is affecting them? I remember, as a student, I was in agricultural college for 3 years. At the end of the 3 years, we were told we have no employment, and it used to be automatic employment by the state. And then those who are in the system had extra work. We used to have veterinary extension officers and then crop extension officers. Now, the 2 were merged under unified extension. It means that quickly those who had specialization in veterinary have to quickly learn something about crops and other things, and those who have done crops have to quickly learn something about veterinary. It kind of like gave a lot of burden to those who were already on the field. So basically, it wasn't just about the farmers, it was also the workers, the frontline workers who post-secondary graduates having to take this. But I don't know to what extent you guys have looked at how it's affecting workers such as extension officers.
Thanks, Alas. Next person is Alas. Can I mute you? Next person will be Daniel. And by the way, I mean, I hope we will all bear with our 2 very academic speakers. We're all learning as we go along, and I'm sure as they go along too, they'll find ways to express, themselves, like myself, a bit better. Daniel, well, in a more accessible way is what I meant. Oh, yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the 2 presenters. And, having, worked in the agricultural sector for some time before joining my current organization and the kind of campaign I'm running, I think that they have done, or I would say they are doing a good job, but I don't know whether they are done with their research yet. I was thinking that there is a landmark issue in the agricultural sector in Ghana, which within the context of working class and the struggles of farmers should be addressed. And that has to do with the campaign either for or against genetically modified organisms or GMO. I think that there were a number of issues which were raised by these organizations, especially led by the Food Sovereignty Ghana. And one key issue was the fact that, yes, as far as GMO is concerned, it's about the sovereignty of Ghanaians, the sovereignty of farmers to own and grow their own seeds. That is one. The other argument was that it's unwise as a nation or as a community to more or less, or in quotes, securitize your seed, to hand over your seed, the control and production of your seed to a private entity, which means that how much is available for you to buy and grow is dependent on how much these organizations or these companies are able to produce. Yes, they took the case to court. There have been a number of issues or outcomes as regards the case, and so I thought that should, play a very prominent role in your work. The other thing has to do with what I think Faisal raised, and the fact that the crisis has a lot more to do with capital. I think that in 2016 thereabout, a man who owns a fertilizer company is not Ghanaian, said that in a very, very big agricultural meeting organized by MOFA, he said that Africa is the next agriculture of the world. He was class 4, but I found the statement very intriguing, in a sense that it was representing a clear indication of capital that has been accumulated and was finding ways of investing. And clearly, if you look at the various policies of Ghana, from even the number of the policies before FASDER, from FASDER to METASIP, including what was regional based called the cadet, you realize that it's more centered on commercialization, which is why the fertilizer companies and the other companies were prominent in developing projects towards that line. And I saw that I know that he has been touched on, but I think we may have to look at some of these things in detail. So basically, these are just few comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Anyone else? I see no.
Okay.
Sorry.
Hello, boss.
Yeah, hi. I'm going to ask Kojo Amano, okay, and then after that, Tete. Yeah. Kojo, I think you're muted.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'd like to take off from where the last speaker was going when he was talking about commercial developments. Yeah. So, and of course, if we're looking at commercial developments, then we have to link it to processes of social differentiation, class differentiation, yeah, in the rural areas. And I think when we look at policies too, we have to look at the policies very critically and ask what interests are represented in these policies, yeah. And when we're looking at the landscape in Ghana, it's not just a national or a local landscape. It also involves a lot of international capital, yeah. And since the 1990s, there's been a huge expansion of capital, yeah, international capital. And so we also have to look at how does the government relate? And I'm sure the first speaker, he's also getting at these. That's Asante, when he's talking about both of them, the way they brought up the commoditization of agriculture, but also when he's talking about the choiceless democracy. Yeah. But he didn't go into it. When you're mentioning choiceless democracy, what makes a democracy choiceless? And why isn't the democracy responsive to the needs of the people? So I think that's a critical starting point. We have to look at why doesn't the democracy respond to the needs of the people? Yeah. And who is it, and whose interests is it responding to? Yeah. And when we're looking at all these policies, then we have to look at who the actors are. When we're looking at fertilizers, yeah. Well, who are the people producing fertilizers? Who benefits from expansion of fertilizer use? And the chemical fertilizers, they're not produced in Ghana. They're produced by very large monopoly transnational corporations, yeah. And so a lot of these seeds, all these inputs which are being promoted by government, and the government are subsidizing them, they're subsidizing them in the interest of these transnational corporations. Yeah. And some of these corporations also have farmer associations. Yeah. And so, for instance, the international fertilizer company, Yara. Yara is the second largest fertilizer company in the world, yeah. And it controls this farmers association, yeah. It supports a farmers association which encourages farmers to buy inputs from transnational corporations. So these kind of developments, they don't stand from the interest of the farmers. They don't start from building a coalition of farmers standing for the interests of small farmers, but they stand for transnational corporations and commercial interests. So what we're having increasingly is we're having an alliance between a national commercial class which wants to invest in commercial agriculture and transnational input suppliers who benefit from this expansion of transnational agriculture. And in fact, when you look at most value chains which are, if we use that term, which are controlled, I think I can use it there because they are controlled by transnational corporations. Those that come under transnational corporations, farmers get a very small percentage of the profit, yeah, often less than 10%, of the value. So in oil palm, I think it's about 8% of the value goes to the farmers, and in cocoa it's 6%. Yeah. So the economy is being increasingly dominated by these transnational corporations who influence policy. They have big programs which they're involved in the formulation. We go into the ministries, there are people there who represent their interests and are shaping policies in their interests. Yeah. And so these are things we need to bring into analysis, yeah. On the second speaker too, there were some things I thought needed to be, when he was looking at, needed to be more clearly defined and sharpened. For instance, when he was looking at dispossession in land, he was suggesting that dispossession was because farmers were selling off land willingly, because of unemployment. But a lot of dispossession is not occurring. It's a coercive dispossession. It's a forced dispossession, but it's selective. So it's the chiefs who dispossess small migrant farmers in the transnational, in the transition zone, and then they give it out to large transnational corporations. And sometimes in these, you sign things like 30,000 hectares, and there are thousands of farmers being dispossessed in this thing. So we don't have to, we don't bring it down to conflicts in inter-community conflicts between Fulani, and most of the Fulani are not rich pastoralists. They're small. They heard they're expanding are owned by big business people and politicians. And that's where the problem is coming, is because of the capital behind who are employing them. They're in the role of as a laboring people there, yeah. So we need to focus on the large players in the system, the way international capital is transforming the agricultural landscape. That's my contribution.
Yeah, thanks, Kojo, and a very helpful one too. I'll let you run well beyond your 3 minutes. Tete, have you managed, or you want to speak?
Pardon?
I think, no, there's Tete. Tete wanted to speak. There's Tete, there's Jifa, and Leo. Is he gone? Okay, Jifa, then Jifa, if you can take the floor. After that, Leo. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, and I have a few reflections here. I think the recent issues about the food crisis in the country, the rising price of food in the country, also give us a cause to think about the crop flexing. Using crops, a concept used to describe the transition of the deliberate use of crops that are used for food, traditionally for industrial purposes, either non-food or even food industrial purposes. So for instance, when cassava becomes BA, what happens to people who need cassava for their fufu, banku, and others? The same applies to the maize, and there are many others, sorghum and others. So linked to Prof. Amano's point about whose interests, in 2012, when Prof. Mills made a presidential statement about, on the back of trade and physical deficits, made a statement about using local materials. So when they are giving waivers to companies or manufacturers that use local materials for production in Ghana, so they're giving excess duty waivers. What we observed, especially for cassava, because that's what I do for my my research. Just 6 months after the announcement, Guinness Ghana started brewing cassava beer. That's the roots beer. Then the following year, Accra Brewery started with its Eagle Lager beer. And from the observations that we have been making in literature, even before the announcement, there were ongoing discussions with government. So comes back to Prof. Amano's question about we should look critically at what is going on, who is benefiting, and the alliance between the national class, the class at the government, political class, and the international companies. We know that both Guinness Ghana and Accra Breweries belong to their subsidiaries of the world's largest beer brewing companies, multinationals, Submiller and Diageo. So with that kind of thing happening, I will not be surprised that cassava is expensive even now in a harvesting season. So in a week, you could see 150% increase in cassava because even the producer of cassava, the farmer, has to compete with the corporate users. So when there's little policy direction about food crops and how they are used, then we see some of these crises happening. My other reflection or the concern is about what happens in the agrarian areas, not only in agriculture, but also in other resource producing areas. So, for instance, what is happening in the salt producing areas in Adan and the massive dispossession of Adan, Keta, Adina areas, the massive dispossession of salt winners, the smallholder salt miners or the winners, and then the takeover by big cooperatives, big corporations, and the state, with the states endorsing it. So in this case, if you speak to the states, you are not likely to find any answers and you're not going to change. So that's where the mobilization thing comes in. And I agree with Faisal and Kofi about the weaknesses in the farmer cooperatives or farmer organizing. But I think that we also have to acknowledge the daily struggles in the agrarian areas over resource the dispossession, the encroachment on the company lands, and those other daily struggles that farmers and then others have to go through. It's a reminder that they are aware of the injustices and are trying to do something about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jifa. Great contribution. I think Leo is next. Before he comes, I also have a question, which is that, in talking about constructing an agenda which is rooted in the interest of, the majority of working people in the country and so on. I mean, one of the challenges is that it doesn't happen automatically. I mean, we know that. And even within the agrarian sector, both speakers and many contributors have pointed to reasons why this is the case. But when you look at, for example, if you cast the lens a bit wider, and you look at, for example, where do you join the interest between, let's say, urban workers and the urban poor who want and need cheap food, and farmers who are struggling to raise their income, for example. I mean, these are some of the. I just want to pose that one question as one of the conundrums, for which therefore we need a comprehensive, overview to begin to be able to address. So that's my question to the speakers. Leo, you're next.
Okay, many thanks, Com, and a big thanks to Kofi Asante and Comrade Faisal for the very informative presentations they made. Tom, please, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Thanks. Yeah.
Hello. Okay. Many thanks to the comrades for the presentation. And I think it all points to one of the biggest defects of the capitalist liberal democracy we have, which provides political rights, so-called, and nothing about economic rights. So, I mean, for the first presentation, I was asking the question, and so where are the workers in all of this? But I think later on, Kofi came to that, and then Faisal also tied that up. But I think that's where the problem is. And that also goes to the question that Kofi also posed about whether we are dealing with a new patrimonial problem or an electoral competition problem. And I mean, the answer could be that it is both. I mean, you are looking at issues of corruption in election and non-election years. And actually, I mean, this has not been studied yet, but then I think the election thing also provide an excuse, an avenue for corrupt people to exacerbate that trend. So I think we are looking at both, but then we are also looking at both as the effect of, I mean, the kind of political system that we existed. I mean, for example, if we have enough direct democracy and representation, and you have workers being able to raise questions on some of these issues, I don't think we will have the problems as reflect from the presentation that we saw, and some of it were very startling. For example, if you look at the priority given to seeds and fertilizers, I mean, we know what that means, and I think Comrade Amano also raised that issue. I mean, you are dealing with some more powerful interests who will influencing the system, but then we also know about the issue of procurement and the politics around that, and who is able to push forward. And I think that stats you show, I mean, was very particularly compared with the amount allocated to extension and then also to marketing. I mean those two areas, are very challenging. But then who is there to present the voice of workers, of ordinary people? And I think that brings us to the question that Faisal posed, whether that there is a need for a different type of organizing for agrarian workers. And I think the answer is yes, because if you look at the current model, it is about how to survive within the inequalities that they find themselves in. It's about survival, but then you also need a different kind of organizing that is able to take on some of these policies that basically, give basis to the kind of distribution of budgets that we saw that are able to take on some of these. And maybe Kofi also mentioned that even Guta at their level have been able to harness some political power and are able to influence things in Accra here. And I think that is also what is required, a different kind of organizing that also touches on some of these key political questions and civic issues. So the presentations are very eye-opening, and they point to some of the challenges, outstanding work that we have to do as comrades. Thank you.
Thanks, Leo. I see no other hands at the moment or comments in the chat, so I'll invite, whilst perhaps others are chewing on what they want to say, I'm going to invite Kofi and Faisal back in that order to maybe pick up some of the things the observations that have been made and so on. So Kofi, you first, and then Faisal.
Okay, thank you very much, Baz, and I thank all the participants for the great questions, many of which provide very good food for thought. So I would address, but how long do we have to respond?
Is 4 minutes an inhuman constraint?
Okay, so I'll try and
because I'm assuming that there will be maybe a last round of a couple of questions, and then you get a chance to wrap up anyway.
Okay,
you know
right.
Okay, all right, thanks. Yeah.
So first, the question of extension. That's a very important one. In the first study I mentioned, we spoke to some extension officers, and actually Jifa was part of that study. What the extension officers told us was that for years there hadn't been any recruitment. So I forget the name of the participant who asked the question, but that has been a key problem. And for about a decade, I think for most of the parts of the 90s and the early first decade of the 2000s, the extension service was subsisting on grants from Canada. And, he told us the situation has eased a bit because since the introduction of the NAPCO, Nation Builders Corps, they get recruits are posted there, but then they need to be trained first. And many of these recruits have no agricultural background. Some studied accounting, etc. So they need to be trained for that. So that's an issue, and it goes to the issue of the retrenchment of the state, which started under structural adjustment. As we've seen over the years, especially after democratization, the level of discipline in the implementation of liberalization policies hasn't been consistent. However, at the core of most of the policies, the declining role of the state is still core there. And the issue of GMO is also very important, and I fully agree. It's an issue of sovereignty. You can't allow the livelihoods of the of farmers, but also of the entire country to be taken hostage. And this issue has achieved even renewed urgency in the era of COVID, especially for most of last year when borders were closed, and for a while it looked like in the long term we would have to be self-sufficient to a very large extent. So it's very, we are now in very unstable times, and with the way global events are going, it's very likely we could confront another pandemic. So we have to be thinking very closely about our internal food security. And Professor Manos' question about policies and whose interests are represented, it's a very crucial one. I couldn't go into a lot of those, but maybe let me mention just a couple of it. Most of the policies in the oil palm sector especially has the heavy influence of the Dutch donor agency and France as well, Agence Française de Développement. And many of the policy proposals, like the increasing reliance on the market, for instance. In fact, they've been fighting government for a while because one, they want the reliance on fertilizer subsidies as a way of boosting agricultural productivity to be reduced, but not to be reduced for the reason that many activists are calling for. For instance, the destruction of the soil, and just the general ineffectivity of chemical fertilizers as opposed to organic fertilizers. The main reason why they are unhappy with how government is implementing the fertilizer subsidy program is because they want to develop private markets for fertilizers. So that's a key issue. Now, not private, but civil society or non-governmental actors have also been very active in the sphere, in the sector. And let's take one issue, which is the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, which is a global initiative coming from Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia, etc., where the key producers, they participate in the international market. And they have all these sustainability targets because they want to meet obligations on limiting climate change. And over the cultivation of oil palm has gone hand in hand with severe environmental damage. There's a bit of that in Ghana, but oil palm cultivation is not a big source of environmental degradation or loss of forest cover. And yet, most of the CSOs or NGOs active in the oil palm sector are very key on pushing for RSPO certification, even among small-scale, smallholder oil palm farmers. And again, as we see, the value chain is bifurcated. So the smallholder farmers are really not participating in the international market to any appreciable degree. And yet, they are the targets for this training on sustainability, the RSPOs. So here again, there's an issue of interest, right, and mismatch of interventions.
Kofi, any chance you can finish here so that you know, I mean, in the hope that we will get a final round. If there's not, you can come back soon enough.
Okay, yeah. So I think I can end here.
Okay.
Then I'll come back when.
Definitely, you definitely will. So, Faisal.
Thanks, Baz. So I will just quickly go through the points. The first on commercialization and differentiation. No, I mean, absolutely. If one takes all the models of kind of commercialization from the plantation, the commercial farmer, the outgrowers, of course, they are not only linked to social differentiation, they build on social differentiation and further deepen social differentiation. So completely agree, point well taken. Now, there's a point around displacement. So when I talked about the migrant who was pushed off the farm because of apparently the value of the farm had increased, you know, as a result of the activities of plantation owners, I was not limiting displacement to voluntary transaction. Alienation of land happens, of course, through extra economic factors, and the economic factors are not kind of clearly delineable from each other. I mean, they are very much close. But what I'm saying is that this is one case, and I have come across many instances where people were, you know, forced off land due to these kinds of arrangements. But what is important, though, and I think this is where for me the point lies, is to focus on the set of pressures, you know, that the extra economic pressures that push people to engage in what might seemingly appear to be voluntary market transactions. Then there is the point on you know, Fulani, the whole moral panic around the Fulani. Now, I think on this point I have to disagree. I think that differentiation does expand these divisions, and indeed it is at least in certain parts of the country, it is this differentiation that begin to ethnicize relations that in the public sphere were governed by kind of occupational groupings or even just residential patterns. So differentiation is really crucial in this tension. And the reason why I focus on this is because I think there's a broad climate of ethnicizing the public sphere and instrumentalizing identity as a mechanism of rule. And I think in the Fulani case, it is apparent both at the level at which it comes from the top, but also the set of ideas that are now being resurrected about difference in pushing this forward. Finally, I want to come to Baz's point, and I think this is important like the other points. For me, really, this is the heart of it. What do we do from here? So let's take the case of the urban worker who needs cheap food, the outgrower, or let's say the semi outgrower who also provides for his immediate food, but maybe doesn't make enough from what she sells. I think this is where politics matters, Baz, and this is where this aspect of the international dimension has to be brought into place. Given the limitations of operating from a small country like Ghana, and the fact that if one takes pineapple or orange or other cash crops, these are deeply tied into global chains of production, but also other dimensions of global accumulation, that it is precisely here that the role of an organization like this, or all those who are committed to social transformation, comes to play. To say, how do we work, whether it's with university workers who are on strike, market women who are fighting against local authorities that levy them outrageous municipal rates, or unemployed youth who are imagining a different kind of society. Now, I do not see how
Yeah, thanks, Faisal, and important points too. Obviously, people have mentioned, for example, the question of climate change, of the investment regime, and so on. So there's definitely a global, a broad global dimension to it. But precisely because of the point that you made, also, that we need to develop an agenda around questions that and conditions that those in this sector confront. What kind of land reform do we want? What kind of agrarian restructuring do we do? Those kind of things. I think that it's important to keep the two dimensions, developing alongside each other and interacting with each other. So thanks for that. I'm sure others will come back, as well, and you also get a chance right at the end to come back. At the moment, there's Tete. Yeah, there's you, and there's a question. Well, not a question, but a comment in the chat about farmer indebtedness. Basically suicides and crises and so on and so forth. So if the speakers want to take those in mind as well. Tete, you take the floor now, please.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I have a bit of a problem with my internet, so it's not stable. So I think I can shut down my video now. And I want to say thank you to the presenters and the question that went ahead before me. I mean, I found the interesting focus on policy failures and the mobilization around it very interesting as a very good detail into how we understand both the problems of failed policy and just the way to go forward. But I was imagining that maybe the issues of, and I think Mr. Kofi Asante referred to them a bit when he talked about the bifurcation of the palm oil value chain. I was thinking that maybe the policy failures and organizational failures themselves, we could benefit a bit more if we rooted them within the structure of the agricultural sector as a whole, and the role that agriculture plays in the political economy of the Ghanaian economy, and therefore the issues of relation between agriculture industry that Faisal and Bazini just talked about, and the tensions within the agriculture. So, for instance, the one part of the question of structure and political economy was something that Professor Manuel has raised about just the ways in which production of agricultural products for export, which is one of the key elements of the bifurcation of agriculture, is dominated by transnational corporations in terms of their value chain. And the production of agriculture for the domestic economy, and I'm talking about domestic economy beyond simply food production, it's either not, there's not enough attention paid to it, there's very little investment in it, there's nothing in it. So that in the sense of what we are talking about is the dynamics between two different sectors and the class relationships that go with them. Because it seems to me that the connection that we need to draw between the totality of the rural economy, agriculture, the urban economy, the rural economy will benefit if we are able to keep this role of agriculture, the structure in mind. Otherwise, it seems to me that the crisis that we are describing is basically just crisis which seems to come from specific failure of policy or specific areas in terms of rise in food prices, or that relationship to income earning outside the agricultural area and stuff like that. And I'll be very interested whether there is some ongoing study now that at least traces this structural structure of the economy. I think that's important also because in a certain sense, Mr. Asante suggested something that I think maybe we have to revisit, because what I hear him say is that in the early period of post-independence up till structural adjustment period, there was a very heavy state intervention and state support in the agricultural sector. And then since structural adjustment, we then ran into the question of liberalization and deregulation with all these problems. But it is possible to argue that even in the Nkrumah post-independence period, the same bifurcation where a lot more attention is paid to agricultural production for export and relatively less attention to production for the domestic economy is still there. So it's part of the fact that Nkrumah did pay more attention and extension services to domestic economic production. It is still something that was not sufficient. So that we can, in my mind, judge the policies, both the current policies and earlier policies, against the demands and imperatives of the structure of our economy. It's something that I'm struggling with, and I'll invite a bit more commentary on that for the purposes of the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Tata. I think a number of comments have been alluding in the direction that you've raised. So thank you very much. Very helpful. Percy, I think. Dr. Percy? Percy, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, we can. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Basically, it's not really any questions I want to raise. Just a couple of observations. That from where I sit, I see that policy is essentially driven by donor interests, and they're all geared towards accelerating the capitalist development in the countryside, in the rural economy. Where you find organization, it is led by corporate interests as part of the business of making their businesses more, quote unquote, efficient and profitable. Alongside that, sometimes you have, and this has, I think, been the case since Nkrumah, you have the state. They also sponsor farmer organization. But having what you might call self-activated and self-conscious farmer organization is nearly absent. And I would also add that historically, small farmers have addressed the issue of tenure insecurity through what we term shifting cultivation. I mean, and as the population has grown, and as the amount of arable land nearby per head has gone down, you also have increasing problems and conflicts with herders who are basically also engaged in shifting grazing. You know, they don't have land, they cannot develop, except that they don't have to move the animals around, so they must also shift and move around in terms of herding. And in all this, I mean, I can say that over the past couple of decades, close to 3 decades, I'll say, I've repeatedly sat in meetings when the issues of agriculture have come up. The issue of land policy comes up each time, but it is either muted or omitted in the final summary. And the issue really is this, without security and tenure, people are not going to invest their time and labor in the sector. And so right now what you have is that you have an array of factors that are all acting to push people off the land, out of small farmer business, and so that the land can be turned over to private, corporate, often external interests. That's what I wanted to say for now. And just as an addendum, I joined the meeting very late, so I missed all of the first presentation and most of the second presentation, but I'm happy to be here.
Thanks, Bessie. We're also very happy you made it. And we will send the recording. We'll send the recording for those who are interested.
Sure.
Others. On which note, let me make the point also that this, as we said from the beginning, this is an ongoing discussion. We are compiling. We're beginning to develop, a program around this question, and it is one of the first, if you like, big in-person meetings that we will have in the coming weeks, more likely than not in next month. And I think that a couple of day schools that we have in the works on climate change and the environment, on agrarian crisis, and also on the economy writ large, and also on the question of identity politics. This will definitely be one of the things that feature in that. For now, we will be able to share the recording. We will be able to share the references that have come up, and we'll continue to develop our thinking and points of view on this particular subject. But given the time now, I'm going to ask the two speakers to come back, make their final comments, and wrap up as well. The contact address for the ISO and the SSWN is in the chat, both email and WhatsApp. And please feel free to, drop your own contacts as well, and we'll pick things up from there. As usual, there's much more that we want to say, but at some point we have to wrap things up for today. So I'm going to ask in the order that they first spoke, Kofi and then Faisal. Please, it's 10 to 6, so maximum 5 minutes each, max. In fact, if you can do 4, even better. Thanks, Kofi. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Baz, and thanks to the party for all the great suggestions. I think I would only try to address the issue of how to join rural and urban interests in terms of mobilizing, and just generally how to mobilize to push policymakers or elected politicians to address the failures that I spoke about. Now, I've often said that electoral politics, the best you can say about it is that at least it's entertaining, it's distracting, and you can see that in all the razzmatazz around debates and things like that, and post-debate analysis focusing on who won and who lost. But when it comes to actually solving problems, it's by design structured to actually exacerbate problems and actually surface problems which didn't exist at all, which wouldn't have existed but for the intervention of politicians looking for votes. And I'm saying this in the context of how to address the problems and how to mobilize, I feel the response lies beyond the current political system. And in thinking about a solution, I am reminded of a book I read recently on the struggle of the Ada, struggle over the Songo Lagoon, and attempts to fend off corporate control over the lagoon. Historically, access to the Songo Lagoon, it's been very inclusively managed, and strangers from other parts of the country, even outside the country, people come as far as from Nigeria to mine or win salt in the lagoon. And the struggle has been to keep it as it is against incursions from corporate interests as well as governments. But this is at a local level. And so what is needed is to join it to a much broader level. You know, Faisal talked about the importance of linking national struggles to the international ones. And at this point, I don't think I have any clear answer as to what such a struggle would look like. But luckily, Faisal and I are working on that in the next project that we are trying to put together. So hopefully, in a few months' time, we can have a similar forum and share what we found or thoughts that we are coming up with. Okay, thank you.
Well, thanks, Kofi, and we value your contribution already today, as it is, and we know we can expect more and working together in the future, in coming weeks, and for the long term. So, Faisal, you have the final word.
Yeah, thanks, Baz, and thanks to everyone for their comments. So I think Tete's point is really important, that one needs to not only locate agriculture in the broad political economy of the country, but also see how whether it's the overly export-reliant character of kind of cash crops creates certain class relations, differentiates people in the rural areas, but also how that relates to broad social differentiation in the society. So I think that's a really important one. And I want to say a few things in relation to that, and this is linked to the point of struggle already. To say that the point of this conversation really is to think through what are those points of struggle in the country where ordinary working class people are toiling, but also pushing back through organizations that might be incoherent in the present, but have some potential, of leading to something transformational. And this is happening against the backdrop of a kind of mobilization, which is largely middle class and related to questions around tweaking the governance structure. To say, if we begin from the conditions of ordinary people on the land, conditions of ordinary people in urban areas who cannot afford the basic necessities, what kind of politics and what kind of response are we going to have to the agrarian crisis, but to the national crisis, which of course is a product of the global system, which differentiates people and differentiates parts of the world. So for me, this is really the heart of it, to say, what do we do from here? And I think two things to end. The first is really organization. Organization, not necessarily one particular organization, but a coherent politics which is rooted in the aspirations and the capacities of ordinary people. Yes, the question is how. I think there are a number of struggles happening around the country. So the point is, how do we relate to these struggles? How do we build on these struggles? Especially at a time where some of these struggles might appear distant and removed from immediate material questions. So the attack on LGBTQ people, I think, is central to how differentiation, but also how differential access to resources and to being human function. If some people can be targeted, eliminated, then some people can also be said to be relegated, to those who only provide labor and get a very limited share of that which they produce. So I want to end here, Baz, by emphasizing what I think is central, the need for politics, the need for organizing, the need to realize that the material might not always be apparent when we look at issues around targeting minorities, but at the end of it, that is what it is. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Faisal. Thank you, Kofi, and thank you to everybody who has participated and spoken and asked questions. No doubt, there's a lot more to be said. Even off the top of my head, there's a million things that one could say, even by way of a summary. I'm not going to attempt that. I'm simply going to say that whatever points have been made here are precisely the subject matter and the guiding, they offer the guidance in terms of our further development of our ideas, of our discussions, of our interactions around this question, and to develop the kind of agendas that enable the kind of, transformationally oriented interventions that can build up to the kind of vision that Faisal and Kofi have offered us for starters today. As I said at the beginning, those who are interested in the recording, we will share with them. The references that we've also compiled as part of this thinking through this issue, we'll also share with them. The questions that have been raised will all be summarized and circulated, and the way in which we plan to address, continue the discussion and address some of those questions will also be made, that information will also be shared with everybody. So at this point, I simply want to thank everybody and say that, no matter what we look at, whichever way we look at this question, it's a huge question, including starting with the question of the prices, because of course, the food price inflation is a pressing thing. It speaks volumes, not simply in terms of the immediate burdens on people, but in terms of the whole structural factors that have brought the situation to this. We stand even more imperiled in the future in terms of the continued encroachment of the interests that have already become dominant, as so many people have referred to, plus other issues such as ecological stress, social conflict, and so on and so forth. So, and of course, this the big question of pandemics and the natural resource exploitation, the role of that in that process as well. So, comrades, I simply want to thank you, and I'm sure that we will begin to make some, rounded, draw some rounded conclusions in the very near future, which will enable all of us not simply to deepen our thinking, but actually to begin to make a difference in however marginal a way to start with, wherever we are, which will then adds up, provides the evidence of what further can be done, gives the encouragement of the capacity to continue to build and take the transformation agenda that we're talking about forward a lot more consistently, a lot more coherently. So good night, good evening to everybody, and see you very soon. I hope we all see you back here next Sunday. But before then, you'll get the results of this conversation tonight. So thank you very much, and good night.
Thank you, God.
All right.
And do have a lovely night too.
Thank you.
Thank you, Baz. Thanks for everyone.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Very useful.